Bismillah. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. إن الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. أما بعد. Okay, so Jazakumullah khairan. It was a very good talk on the last section by Brother Asadullah. MashaAllah, really was of benefit. Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. All right, so my topic today will be on navigating doubts and some practical tips, inshallah. And I want to start off with 5 years ago, 7 years ago, actually in 2013, I had to repeat my Shahada because I remember that time, subhanAllah, I was reading a book. And I don't tell people this story, actually, it's I think first time I've told people this story. I was reading a book and there was one in-depth issue I was going through, written by a non-Muslim. And then my Iman completely left my heart, and I was, making a big deal out of this problem. And I actually had to say my Shahada that same day. And I thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that Allah allowed me to take my Shahada again. And through my own introspection, it allowed me to think about how do I deal with questions and doubts that come our way. So why is it that two people who are exposed to the same question or doubt, yet one person experiences a crisis of faith and the other person does not? For example, I've dealt with some friends who 6, 7, or actually 8 of them in high school left the religion, and 3 in university. People I know who are Muslims, they left the religion. And I've had brothers who had doubts in Islam and confusions. But when they had confusions and doubts, they were able to reconcile it. So what was the difference between these two groups of people? So first, I'm going to start with the types of doubts. So it's not a comprehensive list, but it's as comprehensive I could make it. And the first one would be the whispers of shaitan, or your fleeting thoughts that one abhors. And there's a hadith by Abu Hurairah where a companion came to him and said, Ya Rasulullah, we have thoughts which we cannot dare talk about, and we do not like that we have them, so we abhor them, and we don't even want to talk about them. And the Prophet ﷺ said, have you actually experienced that? And they replied, yes. And he said, ذَاكَ صَرِيحُ الْإِيمَانِ, that is clear faith. So these are thoughts that come into your head. You don't really believe them, and you just, a'udhu billah, just some strange thought. We always have strange and weird things that come into our heads. So these are not really, something that lingers in the mind. Then there's also intellectual doubts, where you're presented with an argument confuses you, and then gives you doubts and confusions on the religion. Human beings are a bit more complex than being just an intellectual robot, and we're not just algorithm. And so we have a spiritual side, a social side, and a moral side. So you find more often than not that you won't have an issue that's only an intellectual one. You'll find it's more inclusive of other categories of doubts. So the next category would be spiritual doubts. And spiritual doubts would be something like arrogance, as shaitan did not want to obey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala when Allah told him to bow down to Adam alayhi salam out of respect. He thought, because he put his ego, so there's ego as well as the spirit, which is part of that. He thought that he is better than Adam alayhi salam, and he thought it has to be his way or the highway. And you have a lot of people who say, why does Allah say this in the Quran? Why does the Prophet say this in the Hadith? And why did the Prophet do this and not that? I would have done it differently. So it's ego. We thinking that it is the way we think, conceive of the world is the best way, rather than the being that's transcendent of all human subjectivity. And also another thing with spiritual doubts would be desires. So somebody might have a desire that might go against the religion, and they might be involved in that, and living by people and their desires, they might be easier for them to kind of slide into that denial of what Islam says or rejecting what Islam says. And the next one would be social doubts. We are, humans, we're very social creatures, and we like to conform with others, which I will actually talk about this later on. And the last one is moral doubts. So whether you're mistreated by somebody or other Muslims or your parents, and we basically cannot separate that from the religion itself, and it gives us a very hard time in coming into contact with the religion. So I just want to share a couple of stories where a lot of these ex-Muslims that I met in high school, I knew them as friends, so I decided to speak with them. And I spoke with almost all of them, except for one. And I sat down with them in subway outside my high school in grade 11, and I would speak with them for hours. And we would come to an agreement where, look, first of all, we're going to be honest with each other. Secondly, you're going to list down everything that's bothered you about the religion. And thirdly, if you agree that your questions have been answered sufficiently, you're going to take your Shahada again. And they agreed to these conditions. So we start talking, they list 7 or 5 or 2 doubts, maybe 1 doubt, and you start responding to the first doubt. And they get surprised, and I've noticed this, and maybe 6 or 7 of them, they get surprised. And then we start answering the second doubt, the third doubt, the fourth doubt. That surprise turns into defensiveness and turns into anger. And subhanAllah, all of a sudden, all these random doubts, 10, 11, 12 start coming out of nowhere, out of left field, right? And I told him that, is it not the case that these were the doubts that we spoke of? And that was the one that you only bothered you. And I still responded to the ones after. And eventually, subhanAllah, they would, and he just said, my Quran teacher did this Muslim person did this, my mom did this. So then the moral doubt came out of nowhere. And it was just the intellectual was just a facade, right? And it was really them trying to convince themselves of their emotional state. Another situation was I was discussing on Facebook with a friend when I came back from Egypt and I came to university my first year, and I realized he left the religion. So we were talking for weeks on Facebook and going back and forth on our private chat. And at the end of it, when I demonstrated Islam is true, he said, you're right, but truth does not exist. I don't believe in truth. And subhanAllah, we're discussing truth for what is true for days and days and days, and then went back into corner, just denies truth. And the last situation is a brother in university who came with sheets of papers with doubts, just literally lists. And we would sit in the university and we'll go through them. And he maybe didn't answer all of them, but he'll continue praying. It didn't bother him. So what was the difference between these two? And this is why I want to go into the practical tips. Number one, first practical tip, declutter your mind. So you want to write down the specific doubt that is a cause of confusion in your mind. So the analogy I like to use is when you have so many things in your mind, you wake up and you have so many things you need to do, university stuff, work, cleaning the house, all these things you need to do that are really kind of emailing people, and you feel overwhelmed. But when you write these things down, things start to appear to become more manageable. Things you discover you have more free time, and that things weren't as bad as you made them out to be when they're all just ringing inside of your head. And so that would be the first tip. The second tip is take a break. You once you write down the questions, all the doubts, you take a break, you do something else, and you revisit it when you're not as emotionally invested. And when you can view things more objectively. Oftentimes you realize that, we've made a mountain out of a molehill. And just because a molehill has a sign, Mount Everest, doesn't make it a mountain, right? It's just a molehill. The third practical tip is to deconstruct the doubts. And this is what the last talk was about, may Allah bless Brother Asadullah, is you start by examining the assumptions behind certain doubts and questions. What are these doubts assuming? Are these assumptions even valid? And if they're not, you start crossing them out. We need to be critical thinkers, subhanAllah, and we shouldn't take every single claim that we hear seriously without analyzing its assumptions, especially when they go against the religion, right? We are so critical of the religion and we're not critical of other things, subhanAllah. And the way we sometimes treat so-called experts in online forums is, it's how, in the COVID pandemic now, we see a lot of our elderly relatives and parents, they're just sharing fake news left, right, and center, right? Something's on WhatsApp, it's a video, it's true news for them. They don't analyze it sometimes. And we do the same thing when it comes to doubts, when it comes to online forums, when it comes to so-called experts, we just accept that without thinking critically. As Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah advised his student Imam Ibn Qayyim, don't make your heart like a sponge that absorbs doubtful arguments that come its way. Rather, make your heart like a crystal clear glass, which is solid enough to repel the doubt, but is transparent enough to see straight through into the doubt. So the fourth tip will be having intellectual humility. Acknowledge our own limitations and our own intellectual humility. Know that a few things. Number one, just because you have not found the answer yet, and you don't know the answer, only means you don't have the answer right now. That's it. SubhanAllah, right? Nothing more, nothing less. Knowing something is true is different than knowing how to articulate something intellectually. So maybe someone says something about the religion of Islam. How do we know Islam is true and Allah exists? But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala exists, but it's kind of hard for you to articulate it. Realize these are separate things. Knowing something is true and knowing how to articulate it. Just because you can't intellectually articulate something doesn't mean you don't know it to be true. And also, we need to have humility because we have a lot of lack of knowledge when it comes to religion. And I call it Swiss cheese methodology, right? We have so much holes in our understanding of the religion, yet we try to go into such in-depth and high, deep topics and go into it. If you don't know the first law, second law, third law of Newton's laws, you're not going to start going into Newtonian physics, let alone quantum mechanics, right? And so Islam is a very deep science, and we have to approach Islam with humility, just like we approach other fields with humility. And we must also realize that there's limitations of science and what the human mind can come with, right? And as Brother Bassam Zawai said, Being reasonable entails you knowing the limits of your reason, especially once one is convinced, and I added this, especially once one is convinced of the foundations of the religion. So that's intellectual humility. Next is seeking knowledge. Seek knowledge and traverse a journey to find these answers. So you bring your questions to those of knowledge in the matters that we're asking about. And this is something that is, we have to ask ourselves, do we even know about Allah? Do we know Allah's names? Do we understand Allah's names? Do we even know Islam? Do we understand and have a relationship with the Quran? Do we know what the surahs of the Quran are talking about? Or the themes? Do we even know about the Prophet's life? These are very important things that we have to understand, and we have to realize and seek out that knowledge sincerely. Next is improving our social circle. The Prophet ﷺ said, "You're upon the religion of those around you." And this is a picture from the Ash conformity experiment in 1951, where you have a person who is the person who's being experimented upon. They come into a room, they have 8 other people with them, all of them are actors, right? And you see a line on the left-hand side of the screen, and you have to match that line to the numbered lines on the right-hand side of the screen, which is this line matches line number 3. But these actors will say that this is they'll say, this line is actually line number 1 or line number 2. So everyone will be like, this line is line number 1. And everyone will be saying it. When it comes to the person who sees clearly it's line number 3, they'll say it's line number 1 or line number 2, just as everyone has said it. 40% of the participants would do this, subhanAllah. So they changed what they conformed with the group, even though it directly contradicted what they saw with their very own eyes. And when they were debriefed after, and they asked the participants, why did you do that when you knew you were saying what is wrong? And they said the group must be right. So this aspect of conformity. But even though we're surrounded with a very un-Islamic environment, the good news is that this yielding effect, they called it, or conformity, dropped down to 5% when only one person before them said the right answer. So improving our social circle, we're upon the religion of those around us. Number 7, Ibaadah, Athkaar, and Tadabbur. We have to increase our, our actions, our worship, our dhikr. When we say Alhamdulillah, we really understand Alhamdulillah, not just saying Alhamdulillah, Alhamdulillah, and not thinking about it, and reflecting on the Quran and building that spiritual humility. And there's a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ which says that men will continue to question one another until they say, Allah has created all things, but who created Allah? And he who found himself confronted with such a situation to say, فَلْيَقُلْ آمَنْتُ بِاللَّهِ, I affirm my faith with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So even though we can intellectually answer this question, I really find 2 benefits from this hadith. One is that it's a good dhikr for these fleeting thoughts, right, that come into our head. But number 2, it's revisiting what we already know. So when we have an issue with the legislation of Allah, what the Prophet did, we'll say, Amantu billah. I know Allah exists. I know Islam is true. Once you acknowledge what you know, the things you don't know start to become very insignificant. And that requires us knowing that Islam is true in the first place. And number 8, finally, is dua. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the all-knowing and can bestow wisdom and knowledge to us when we least expect it. Personally, I've always found that when I stopped caring about an issue, when I really wrote it down, when I started learning about it, when I was sincere, recognized my humility, my limitations, that when I stopped really caring about the issue, all of a sudden, and I made dua, all of a sudden, out of nowhere, the answer comes into my head. And Allah gave me the answer to the issue. And, right after I forgot about it, which happened to me so many times, and it's actually happened to so many people. I consider this almost like a mutawatir kind of thing. So to conclude, there are 8 tips. 1, declare your mind, write a list of your doubts. 2, you take a break, revisit the list after a break, and you cross out the doubts that are based on faulty assumptions. Number 3, we deconstruct the assumptions and logic of the doubt. Number 4, we have intellectual humility. Number 5, we seek knowledge with sincerity and having that spiritual humility. Number 6, we improve our social circle. Number 7, we increase the qualities of acts of worship, our dhikr, remembrance of Allah, and our reflection on the Quran, the holy book of Islam. And 8, with the du'as. So I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Ya muqallib al-qulub, thabbit qulubuna ala dinik, O turner of the hearts, keep our heart firm on the religion. And I hope that these tips have benefited you and benefited all of us, if anyone has a crisis of faith, and also maybe it could benefit advising those around us, friends or family, whether they have crisis of faith. Wa jazakumullahu khairan. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.